Okay, today we're going to wrap up our discussion of the Ramayana in its excerpted version. My goals for today are to review some of the points about justice from last time because they're kind of complicated. I'll do a brief overview of the issues from the last few chapters of the Ramayana that you read. And then we'll open up the floor to you. What questions do you have about the text? And I'm doing this to sort of encourage discussion threads on NYU Brightspace. I assume that you'll have questions about the ending because there's some very strange moments at the end of the Ramayana. Okay, so we talked about this a little last time. A lot of the inner workings of the Ramayana is around this issue of appearances. Can you really trust them? And it's a very difficult thing because we still need to navigate the world, right? Like, even though, sort of the inability to trust our senses is present. And this is especially interesting in a religion like Hinduism, where the mind is always being asked to turn towards the sort of more cosmic or spiritual level of things. So it's kind of interesting that so much of the Ramayana is about these kind of beautiful sensorial pleasures of beauty, and especially, as you'll find, a female beauty. So we talked about this last time. I emphasized how the verbs in this sentence, these two sentences, really emphasize the sort of levels of knowing relative to the physical world. So Rama noticed in the woods, amidst the creepers and plants, in his front yard, a damsel of the utmost beauty. And yet that level of knowledge, that noticing of sensorial features, is not quite the same as the truth behind the facade of Sorpanika, which is that later that Rama is able to realize that Sorpanika had only an appearance of quality and was really cheap and shameless. And so this is, I think, indicative of some of the struggles that Rama will have later in the epic relative to his wife Sita, who is both on the appearance side of things, she's beautiful, and inside her, she's supposed to be beautiful as well. But he has a little bit of trouble reconciling those two facts, or trusting that her inner beauty is pure. Okay, so I talked about this towards the end of last lecture. Given that appearances are potentially untrustworthy, how do we act justly in the world? Which is Rama's central struggle as the sort of preserver between creation and destruction, as the incarnation of the god Vishnu. A lot of the middle and ending books of the Ramayana invite us to think about the world in more simplistic ways through doubles. So women are often kind of held up, I think, for our judgment. Kakai, that's Bharata's mom, who seems to be a little bit less, less virtuous, I suppose, than Sumitra, who is Rama's mother. Sita and Sorpanika are pretty clearly, we're being asked to think about them in relation to one another. We have all these kind of pairs of brothers. So Rama and Bharata. Maybe we're being invited to differentiate between the two of them in terms of virtuous behavior. They certainly are held up as rivals for the throne through their mothers, really. And then we also have this other pair of brothers, Vali and Sugriva. These are the giant monkey brothers who also have a very similar struggle as Rama and Bharata. They both sort of are rivals for the crown. Like they kind of fight over who should be king and that sort of thing. So kind of a similar thing to Rama and Bharata's struggle. And then one other one that I didn't talk about last time, but I think we can think about it in line of this as well, is Ravana, the antagonist of the story. He also has a brother. And it's kind of a little bit of a throwaway moment, but I do find it interesting that Vibhishana defies his blood relationship with Ravana to ally with Rama. which is kind of interesting. So it's a bit like, there's always the potential with these brother groups, potential for betrayal. Sometimes the betrayal is really bad. Like I think when Vali betrays Sugriva, that is kind of considered as a misstep. But when Vibhishana betrays Ravana, I think we're invited to think of that as a good thing, because Vibhishana allies with Rama, this really, really good character. And then, of course, Rama and Bharata refuse to betray each other. In fact, they kind of go back and forth with, like, no, you should rule, no, you should rule, no, you should rule. It's very, like, interesting. So anyway, feel free to bring up comments on this in the discussion posts. So I was inviting us to think about the ways in which distilling complexity into doubles can help us make sense of the world and act as justly as possible. That's the goal, I think. And yet, we find so often in the Ramayana that acting justly is really difficult, even when you can divide the world into two. This is principally shown through the Vali chapter. This is chapter 6 of your reading. Rama kills Vali. Here Vali is accusing Rama of injustice. So our most just character is being accused of being unjust. He says, Rama, the Lord of culture, breeding discrimination and justice, how could you do this? Meaning, how could you kill me? You have destroyed the firm basis of your own virtues. When two persons are opposed to each other, how can you, in support of one, hide and attack the other? Which is a very, understandable critique. It's kind of difficult to see why Rama is justified in prejudice here. Like literally, he's completely prejudiced against Vali. He doesn't hear Vali's side of the story. He only hears Sugriva's, and yet he kills Vali because of what Sugriva says. This doesn't, to me, sound very fair. It's not how, a court of justice is supposed to go. Let's try to make some sense of this. I think one way to do so is thinking about the introductory paragraphs of chapter 6 and some of the more introductory moments in chapter 6. So that's what I'm talking about here. I spoke of this last time a little bit as well, but I'll repeat here. This is when our poet kind of steps in and says, sometimes even a perfect man takes a false step, commits a moral slip, and we ordinary mortals stand puzzled before the incident. Here's the occasion for this slip he's talking about. Rama was an ideal man, all his faculties in control. In any circumstance, one possessed of an unwavering sense of justice and fair play, yet once he acted, as it seemed, out of partiality, half-knowledge, and haste, and shot and destroyed from hiding a creature who had done him no harm, not even seen him. So this is talking about when Rama kills Vali. He sort of hides and kills him. This is one of the most controversial chapters in the Ramayana. The poet asks us to, even though this seems unjust, the poet is asking us to take a broader view of things, because it may be less an actual error of commission on Rama's part than a lack of understanding on ours. Measured in eternity, such an event might stand out differently, but until we attain that breadth of view, we are likely to feel disturbed and question the action. So this is kind of a clue as to what's to come. We're going to question Rama's action until we attain the breadth of view of eternity. Okay, so what does this mean? Here's the sort of like plot. This is from a bas-relief carving in Cambodia. So the Ramayana goes beyond the borders of India, of course, to influence a lot of other cultures. You can even see evidence of the Ramayana kind of inculcating traditions of depicting the Buddha. He kind of seems a bit like a Rama figure sometimes. But here, this is, I really like these images. They sort of like a comic books without the frames. So here's one sort of frame here, the two monkey brothers who are fighting one another, Vali and Sugriva. If you go back to the text, they're fighting, I think Vali is the stronger one. I think he's older too. They're fighting because Vali has like magical powers where he takes other people's powers away from them and grows even stronger. Sugriva tries to find him when Vali goes missing. Somehow this sparks a fight. Vali kind of makes Sugriva be banished to this kind of like mountain thing where he's like trapped. And Vali, while Sugriva is gone, Vali starts sleeping with or taking, I don't know, he like starts dating Sugriva's wife. So like Vali has taken Sugriva's wife. So anyway, these two are fighting over a woman. They're also sort of fighting over the kingship of their land. Sugriva tells Rama of his problems. He only mentions it from his perspective. And then Rama, hearing this, he really feels for Sugriva, and we might think why. Rama is in this situation where a man has stolen his wife. So of course he would feel strongly for this monkey whose wife has been stolen by his brother. Okay, so Rama, this is him in hiding, where he shoots a bow and arrow at Vali, and then what happens over here is this is Vali's death scene, where he's dying and saying like, "How could you do this to me, Rama? Like, this is unjust." Okay, so that's the plot behind this moment. Here is me trying to kind of emphasize something very strange about this chapter 6. So chapter 6, the title that our poet calls, or maybe it's our translator, he terms the chapter, he titles it Vali, sorry. He titles it Vali. These are the lines I read before, but note that there are little mini chunks in the chapter. One of them is Sugriva's story, so that's when Sugriva, the monkey who's Vali's brother, tells Rama of his troubles. And then there's this weird moment where Dundabi's story takes over. And I find this very, very strange because the Dundabi character is so minor. In fact, let me show you here. I'm going to turn to the chapter in the actual text. So here's the Vali thing. So here we're learning about Vali and Sugriva, and Hanuman comes. Okay, whatever. Okay, so here's Sugriva's story where he tells he tells Rama of his struggles. And goes on for a minute. And then we have Dundabi's story. Dundabi's story really ends here. This is it. Like, from these are the bones of the monster Dundabi, and then to push away the bones, and then they push the heap out of sight. I'll say more about this in a second. But that's just really the end of Dundabi's story, and then it continues on to be about Rama and Sita, and then Vali. So let me return to the PowerPoint. So I find this very odd that like Dundabi takes up a lot of space in the form of this chapter, even though his actual story seems rather unimportant. But let's talk about the story. Okay. Okay, so here is Dundabi's story. So this is like the whole point of it. I think it sets a precedent for the story with Vali. Okay. These are the bones of a monster named Dundabi. He was a powerful demon in the shape of a buffalo. He had sought out Vishnu and said, "I wish to engage you in a war." So remember, Vishnu is the god who Rama is the incarnate of. Okay, so I wish to engage you, Vishnu, in a war. Vishnu directed him to Shiva as the appropriate person for such an expedition. Dundabi went to Mount Kailas and tried to lift it off with his horn. Shiva appeared before him and asked, "You are shaking our foundation. What is your wish?" Dundabi said, "I want to fight forever. Please grant me that power." Shiva directed Dundabi to the chief of all the gods, Indra, who said, "Go down to the earth and meet Vali. He is the only one who can fulfill your ambition." So this paragraph is quite odd. So Dundabi is a monster who's in the shape of a buffalo. He's a demon. He really wants to fight forever, and so he goes from god to god, seeking to fight forever. And each of the gods, from Vishnu to Shiva to Indra, keep passing him on to a new person. And apparently Vali is going to be the person that Dundabi should seek out if he wants to fight forever. So this is interesting. Okay, accepting this advice, Dundabi came down and tried to destroy all this part of the earth, shouting foul challenges addressed to Vali. Vali attacked him. Their fight continued for 1 year without a break. Finally, Vali plucked Dundabi's horn off his head and gored him to death, and lifting him by his neck, whirled him about and flung him high into the air. And the carcass flew through the sky and fell down at this spot, where sage Matanga was performing some sacred rites. The sage moved off after cursing Vali for defiling his prayer ground. Rama ordered Lakshmana push away those bones, and Lakshmana kicked the whole heap out of sight, restoring the spot to its original sanctity. Okay, interesting. So this is the whole of Dundabi's story. So here's just an image so you can kind of see it. Here's Dundabi, the buffalo demon, seeking to fight forever, finding his match in Vali, who will fight, for as long as possible with him. They fight for a whole year, and then Vali ends up killing Dundabi. So they seem to be kind of like well matched in a way, although Vali does kill him. So here's the sort of problem. Rama's killing of Vali in this chapter is deemed to be unjust. At the surface level, it seems to be very unjustified, but we are invited to take a broader view. Here's the quote from, "Until we attain that breadth of view, we are likely to feel disturbed and question the action." So how does Dundabi's story relate to this quote-unquote breadth of view? How does the story of a buffalo demon guy being killed by a monkey dude, how does this relate to the breadth of view? So here's me trying to kind of pull all these threads together. Dundabi's greatest wish is to fight forever. He's instructed to find Vali. Vali seems to be able to fight forever, where Indra and Shiva and Vishnu are not, even though they're divine. After Vali vanquishes Dundabi, Dundabi's carcass flew through the sky, fell down upon this spot where sage Matanga was performing some sacred rites. The sage moved off after cursing Vali for defiling his prayer ground. This is very interesting to me. This is the death of Dundabi. This is a death scene. Remember how sacred the body of Hector was. I mean, he was humiliated and defiled by Achilles, but that was kind of all part of the point. Hector's body should be glorified. He's the best fighter in Troy. And in fact, the Iliad ends with the proper rites restored to the body of Hector in this very honorable way. Here we have a carcass of this figure who is dead. We should feel respectful for a dead body. And yet, sage Matanga curses Vali for defiling his prayer ground with this dead body. This is a little disturbing. If someone dies in your house, I mean, you might feel a little disturbed by it, but you would also want to honor the body of the person who died. And yet here we have a sage who is cursing this body because it defiled his prayer ground. And then the very next lines are, Rama ordered Lakshmana push away those bones. Lakshmana kicked the whole heap out of sight, restoring the spot to its original sanctity. So Rama agrees with the sage that these bones are defiling the prayer ground. And so what do they do with the bones? They push them away. They kick them out of sight. This is very, in some ways this would be very disturbing to do to a dead body, but we're being invited to think of this as the actual justified thing to do. That we need to restore the spot to its original sanctity, so let's get rid of the bones of this dude who wants to fight forever. Okay, so I hope that kind of, here pulling it together even more. Why is it just to desecrate Dundabi's bones? It's just because Dundabi's bones were desecrating this prayer ground. So it's that's this thing that is being held up as, two sides of the scale of justice. We desecrate Dundabi because he, in wanting to fight forever, desecrated the sacred ground of the sage. And then, by extension, why is it just to kill Vali without hearing his point of view? I think we're being invited to think of that Vali is a similar creature to Dundabi. He's the kind of guy who wants to fight forever. Maybe it's better to kill off someone like that, because otherwise sacred grounds become desecrated, and other sort of things from that sort of standpoint. So here's what I think is going on in this text. We are being asked to prioritize a broader view of justice, perhaps a spiritual view of justice, over a more immediate earthly view of justice. So where Vali's like, Rama, how could you do this? This is unjustified. You didn't even hear my side of the story. Rama's like, I don't need to hear your side of the story because you are only concerned with like earthly matters. You know, I'm concerned with, you know, the heavens and the sage and that sort of thing. So pause there because there's a lot of implications to this. You know, to my mind, it's actually kind of disturbing. You know, when I think of moments in, I mean, I'm an American. When I think of moments in American history where people are being asked to think of heaven or like, you know, the afterlife, where justice will actually be served. So think of that instead of what's happening to you now, where justice is impossible. Like I find this kind of disturbing, you know, in my mind. You know, like there's an argument to be made that like, you know, that like Christianity being kind of forced upon African American slaves in the American South, you know, Christianity would be like a way to placate them such that they don't respond to the injustices that they're dealing with now, but instead think about heaven, where justice might be served in a broader way. So anyway, I struggle with this kind of argument. But on the other hand, I can see this point of view, and I want you guys to think so too. I mean, sometimes it is, you know, if you do take a broader view of things and think about justice more broadly, maybe justice for more people as opposed to for individuals, you know, perhaps that's, perhaps there's a good thing there. Anyway, I wonder what you guys think of this. But certainly for the Ramayana, our aim should always be the broader view, the sort of view that Vishnu occupies as a god, rather than the view that like a more physical and material creature like Vali would prioritize. Okay, so I really like this image. This is in our story, Lakshmana kicks the bones of Dundabi, but here we see Rama kicking him off the prayer ground. Nice. Okay, so it's justice always so easy. So just to remind you again, like this is kind of like a really big and important part of the Ramayana. That like this is the most controversial chapter, but we're being invited to think of the breadth of view of eternity, as opposed to thinking about partiality, self-knowledge, sorry, half-knowledge and haste and all that. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of like briefly go over some of the major plot points of the rest of the Ramayana with, you know, through pointing out some of its really beautiful imagery that has been inspired by the Ramayana. So this is from like a playing card that it's from the early 20th century. I'm not exactly sure where it's from, but it's definitely from, in some way, it's translated in some way through the French, it seems to me. Le Ramayana Conseil de guerre des peuples sibionnesques. I don't speak French, but I'm trying. So this is the council of war of the simian people, the monkey people. So this is a moment in the Ramayana. Hanuman and Sugriva, the monkey king, they vow to Rama that they'll help him recover Sita, kind of in return for Rama's help with destroying Bali. After a year, though, like they say, we'll help after the rains, but the rains come and go, and the monkeys don't arrive to help Rama, and so Lakshmana has to go see what's going on with the monkeys, and he just finds that they're like really lazy, they've like forgotten, and they're like having too much fun, and they don't want to go to war. So here's Lakshmana, who's got his head in his hands because the monkeys are kind of a little irritating to him. Okay, so the monkey army is kind of an interesting component of the Ramayana. The monkeys are incarnate of divine creatures as well, and yet still I do think that they might be like on a lower level than the humans. It was kind of interesting. But okay, so there's the monkey army. Here's a puppet of Hanuman from the 1950s. So a lot of puppet shows kind of take up this story. You know, the Ramayana is one of the great things about the Ramayana is how many different forms the story can take. There's plays that people do, and here's a, from a puppet show. This is an image from the 16th century AD. So this depicts what's going on in Lanka, which is where Ravana is I think he's the king of Lanka. Most people think Lanka is Sri Lanka, the large island off the coast of India in the south. Ravana is living so in his palace, he's living with all of his girlfriends. This seems to be his main girlfriend. Besides, he wants Sita to be his girlfriend, but she refuses to give herself to him. So here he is with all of his girlfriends. Here he is again, trying to get Sita to succumb to him. She refuses, of course, and there's that part of the story where he cannot touch her without her consent. So until she consents, she's safe, but she's also sort of kidnapped and being held kind of hostage here, it seems like. One really cute detail that you might not have noticed is Hanuman up here. Hanuman at this point is helping Rama, and he can change his size. So he makes himself really, really small so he can spy on Lanka, and he's the one who kind of reports back to Rama what's going on with Sita. Okay, little Hanuman there. Here's a play where in Cambodia, sort of a depiction of the Ramayana where Sita and Hanuman are dancing together. Here's another one of Sita and Hanuman. This is from Bali, and so they incorporate fire in their performance of the Ramayana, which is sort of really interesting in terms of the foreshadowing of the importance of fire to this story. Here's another image. This is sort of depicting the monkey army that Rama is able to assemble. Okay, here's more of monkey war stuff. So here's Rama sort of preparing for the war against Ravana with his little monkey army. Kind of cute. Okay, here's the monkey war. You might compare the description of the warfare to the other war stories we've seen, primarily the Iliad. Pretty interesting. I love this picture. So many decapitations of multiple-headed creatures. Pretty cool. But it was poor little monkey, risking their lives to help Rama get his wife back. Here's Rama and Lakshmana, seems. Okay. Here's a Thai version of the monkey war. It's pretty beautiful. Okay. All right, so after the war, so Rama, of course, wins. He's our hero, obviously. Rama is able to defeat Ravana. And after this, so we're kind of trying to restore order. So after a great period of chaos, you need to restore order. And partly that's done through Rama advising Sugriva, the Monkey King, on being a just ruler. So these are bits of his advice. So he says, gather around yourself those that have integrity, courage, and judgment. Surround yourself with good advisors. Whatever you do, let it be based on the sanctioned codes of conduct. So he encourages a legal system, not just legislating by your whims and emotions and stuff like that. Do not hurt with words, even in jest. Do not hurt anyone's feelings, not even the lowliest. So be very ethical and moral as a ruler. And then I find this one very interesting. He is Rama here. He then expatiated on how far one should surrender one's own judgment to another, especially out of love. Not too far, Rama said, referring to his own pursuit of the golden deer in order to please Sita. Women can lead one to death, he said, referring to Vali's infatuation with Sugriva's wife. So note how interesting this is, that Rama slips from his own experience with Sita, which was about, of course, he did listen to Sita maybe a little bit too much there, but the Golden Deer episode was actually, it put Sita as a victim, right? That's how she gets kidnapped by Ravana. But notice the slip where Rama's trust of Sita turns into women can lead one to death, which is what happened to Vali. I'm not exactly sure that it's fair to say that Sugriva's wife was the reason that Vali died. I'm not exactly sure that's fair, but here we're sort of being invited to think that it's a problem with trusting women or being infatuated a little too much with women. This might remind you a little bit of Agamemnon's advice to Odysseus in the underworld, like there's no trusting wives any longer. So a similar sort of distrust of women here. Okay, let's keep going. This is leading me to the ending of the Ramayana. So this is, in some ways, this is the ending of the Ramayana. After the monkey war, to get Sita back, Rama and Sita are reunited and they rule together as husband and wife. They've got the best friend in Lakshmana, who is, the brother of Rama. They've got the best servant in Hanuman, who's there helping them. This makes everything look really good, like everything looks fine here. And yet, it's not really fine, because what happens to Sita in the end? Sita's trial by fire. So it's actually very unexpected for this ending not to be the end. Like Rama holds a war with the help of the monkeys to get Sita back. You'd expect the only resolution to be, and he got Sita back and they were happily ever after. And yet we have this weird moment where Sita, she basically consents to setting herself on fire. This is often referred to as Sita's trial by fire, maybe Sita's self-sacrifice. So here's how it's told in our version of the Ramayana. So Rama, he gathers everyone together. He makes this announcement publicly, and he brings Sita to this public event, and he speaks directly to her, but in front of everyone. After all this, I must tell you, Sita, that it is not customary to admit back to the normal married fold a woman who has resided all alone in a stranger's house. So this would be a lot to hear your husband say to you if you are his wife. It's not customary to admit back to the married fold a woman who has resided all alone in a stranger's house. He turns to customs and traditions rather than telling her personally, Sita, I'm not sure if I trust you any longer as your husband. He kind of depersonalizes it and makes it seem like he's doing something by custom, as opposed to something that would actually be very painful if this were happening to you. Sita broke down. My trials are not ended yet, she cried. So be it. She beckoned to Lakshmana and ordered, light a fire at once on this very spot. So she asks Lakshmana to light a fire. She jumps into the fire. From the heart of the flame rose the god of fire, bearing Sita, and presented her to Rama with words of blessing. Rama, now satisfied that he had established his wife's integrity in the presence of the world, welcomed Sita back to his arms. Okay, so I've skipped some bits here, but this is really interesting. Sita jumps into the fire and she is preserved in the fire, which is indicative of her purity, and then by doing this trial by fire, she publicly registers her purity, and Rama is able to welcome her back. So you probably have a lot to say here, so here's some questions like, why fire? What does it represent? Why does Sita need to sacrifice herself in this way through fire? I might even do a discussion post, why fire? Because I'm curious what you guys think. Other cultures have scenes of sacrifice as well. If you are familiar with the Christian tradition, Christ, we can see him as being sacrificed. He is crucified on the cross. It's this sort of like torturous death. It's a bit of a trial of his as well. Like he dies on the cross, and yet he's able to transcend death by rising again on the third day. This is the sort of Easter story. Can you think of other sacrifices or trials? Perhaps trials by water. I think in some ways we could see the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Uttam, the Pishti character. He survives a trial by water. He's able to withstand the flood, and by doing so, he's granted immortality. In a way, we can see Sita kind of doing that too. She jumps into the fire, and yet she is preserved. She is seemingly immortal in some ways. What does fire represent here? I think I'm going to stop talking because I want to hear more about what you guys think. So I'll post this in the discussion thread. What does fire represent? Why is it fire that Sita needs to test herself with? But to continue on, our poet, and it might also be our translator, he's trying to emphasize those parts of the Ramayana that he most agrees with. And so I'm saying that now because we'll see another version of this ending for next time. But so here's how our translator / poet sees it. So Rama explained that he had to adopt this trial in order to demonstrate Sita's purity beyond a shadow of the doubt to the whole world. This is kind of interesting to me because over here, it was Sita's decision to do the trial by fire. She says, light a fire at once on this very spot. That kind of contradicts this moment where Rama explains that he has to do the trial to demonstrate her purity. This makes it seem like it's Rama's idea for Sita to be immolated. Immolated is the kind of fancy word for to set on fire. Okay, so this seemed a rather... Okay, so here's our poet coming in again. So he's trying to demonstrate Sita's purity beyond a shadow of a doubt to the whole world. This seemed a rather strange inconsistency on the part of one who had brought back to life and restored to her husband a person like Ahalya, who had avowedly committed a moral lapse. And then there was Sugriva's wife, who had been forced to live with Vali, and whom Rama commended as worthy of being taken back by Sugriva after Vali's death. Under these circumstances, it was very strange that Rama should have spoken harshly, as he had done at the first sight of Sita, and subjected her to a dreadful trial. So I hope you're following this. It seems inconsistent of Rama to subject Sita to a dreadful trial by fire. He's basically subjecting her to death. If she, you would burn up in a fire. This is how humans work, right? That seems hypocritical of him when in other circumstances where women may have sinned or committed a moral lapse, Rama has tried to restore them to their husbands. So Ahalya is restored to sage Gautama. That was from our first lecture. Sugriva's wife, even though she sleeps with 2 brothers, she's restored to Sugriva, even after this lapse. And Sita doesn't commit adultery, and yet she is punished in this very severe way by Rama. Okay, this text continues. The gods who had watched this trial in suspense were now profoundly relieved, but also had an uneasy feeling that Rama had perhaps lost sight of his own identity. Again and again this seemed to happen. Rama displayed the tribulations and the limitations of the human frame, and it was necessary from time to time to remind him of his divinity. So, here we get kind of a broader view, if you will, the view of the gods, who are seeing what Rama is doing and judging him. They're judging him because he's losing sight of his own identity, the fact that he is the incarnation of Vishnu. Instead of remembering that he's a god himself and that Sita is a god herself, she's the incarnation of Lakshmi. Instead of taking that broader view, Rama displayed the tribulations and the limitations of the human frame. Brahma, the creator, addresses Rama in line with this thought. There is neither birth nor growth nor death for the supreme God. He is the origin of everything, and in him everything is assimilated at the end. That God is yourself, and Sita at your side now is part of that divinity. Please remember that this is your real identity, and let not the fear and doubts that assail an ordinary mortal ever move you. You are beyond everything. We are all blessed indeed to be in your presence. So, yeah, Rama needs these reminders of his own divinity. I think in my mind, he also needs reminders of Sita's divinity as well. And he keeps forgetting because he can't get outside of the human frame of mind. This whole thing, I think, is kind of in line with the Hindu struggle between Brahman and Atman. Rama has a lot of trouble keeping in mind that he is part of this samsaric cycle, and he gets caught up in his own individual incarnation, his own individual human existence, his Atman, and forgets that he's actually part of this broader cycle. He keeps forgetting to have this breadth of view. To quote that line from the Bali chapter. Okay, so I invite you to think of Sita's trial by fire as a kind of test. It's a test of her and her purity. So how's a test? For Sita, what does it test? I think it's testing her purity. It tests her virtue as Rama's wife. Through the trial by fire, she's revealed to be an immortal goddess incarnate, because she lives through the fire. It seems to also prove her chastity, not necessarily her virginity. She was married to Rama before. When they lived in the forest, I presume they had sex. The problem is that she's kidnapped by another man and held in his house for a long time. And so you can't really know that they didn't have sex necessarily from Rama's perspective. But from the perspective of this trial by fire, she's revealed to be pure. Does she pass the test? Yes. I mean, she obviously passes the test. She lives. She survives the fire. In a lot of ways, this fire test is very similar to the sort of testing that occurred with Penelope at the end of the Odyssey. Her chastity was also potentially in question. And yet she's able to prove her chastity through the sort of secret signs that she and Odysseus knew about the bed. If she had been sleeping with another man in that bed, then the secret of the bed would have been revealed more broadly, etc. So anyway, so very similar kind of test of female chastity here. And then Sita, of course, passes the test just like Penelope did. But I also think that the fire trial is a test of Rama as well. So what does it test? I think it tests his relationship with his wife. To my mind, he could have just trusted her. He could have let her back into his house and said, I know you're true to me, I trust you. I know that you were kidnapped, you don't have to prove anything to me, honey, that kind of thing. Potentially it tests this. It might test his confidence in his wife, or his confidence in his people's ability to accept his wife. There is that other caveat that he does this test publicly so that everyone in his kingdom knows that Sita is pure. So it's possible that his sort of confidence in his wife's purity needs to be tested publicly, I guess. So maybe he's being tested in that light too. Does he pass the test? I think it's harder to say if Rama passes the test because, in one way, yes, he passes the test because he does trust his wife in the end. But we'll see when we talk next time that actually I think he might still struggle with trusting Sita after her being kidnapped. Okay, so the end. I put a question mark because we're going to talk more about this ending next time. So our translator omits part of the story. So in his words, I am omitting a sequel which describes a second parting between Rama and Sita, with the latter delivering twins in a forest and concluding with Rama and Sita leaving this world and returning to their original home in the heavens. We'll learn more about this version later when Rama, he basically exiles Sita to the forest. So first he's like, okay, the trial by fire, I trust you, come back, let's live together. And they sleep together again, and she gets pregnant with twins. And then he starts thinking, actually, maybe I don't trust you anymore. So he banishes her when she's pregnant into the forest. She delivers her babies in the forest alone and raises them. And then he comes upon them later. We'll talk more about this next time. Okay, this part of the story is not popular. So this is according to our translator. This part of the story is not popular, nor is it considered to be authentic, but a latter-day addition to the Valmiki's version. Kamben does not take note of this sequel, but concludes his tale on the happy note of Rama's return to Ayodhya, that's their kingdom, followed by a long reign of peace and happiness on this earth, and there I prefer to end my own narration. So just to remind you, Valmiki is our original poet. There is a latter-day addition to Valmiki's version. Some people would say that Valmiki wrote it, but Kamben, the poet from the 11th century AD that our translator is translating from, Kamben does not include the sequel, but concludes his tale with a happy note of the return. So our translator prefers to end his narration thinking about Rama and Sita together and happily ever after. That's where he prefers to end his narration. We'll talk next time about the other ending, where there's even more testing of Sita. One thing I'll say is I think ultimately it comes down to the choice we need to make. Do you prefer to think of Rama and Sita tested but then reaffirmed and in love and living happily ever after? Or do you prefer to think of an ending where the female figure cannot stop being tested by the male figure? He doesn't seem to be able to trust her because over and over and over again he tests her, and she can never prove her chastity enough to him. So I think, as sort of contemporary readers of this poem, this epic, we can see it in both ways. It's a compelling story to end with a happily ever after, but from maybe a more like feminist leading or cynical perhaps standpoint, perhaps we would prefer to think of this epic as denigrating Sita, because it might ring truer to the original Ramayana, or to some of the problems of the Ramayana that you guys have been noting in your discussion posts. One thing I'll add here. When Brahma advises Rama to remember your divinity, I think that this is easy to see. It's easy to criticize Rama here because he's displaying the tribulations and the limitations of the human frame, and it's necessary to remind him of his divinity. It's easy to blame him here because he is being a hypocrite, But I would just encourage us to be compassionate to him. There are many ways in which we are hypocrites as humans. It's very difficult to attain a broader view of things and to be truly just in a way that is removed from any self-interest at all. And I'll give you an example of this. I read this article, it was like a psychological study where these heterosexual couples, or heterosexual students in this university were given a survey where they were trying to figure out if people really believed in gender equality. Most people, I think, in this survey were heterosexual. They were asked, do you believe in gender equality? Like, the men and women in general are more or less equal or should be treated equally. And the majority of students, overwhelming majority, said, yes, I believe in gender equality. I think it's, there should be equal treatment of the sexes. And then later on in the survey, there was a question, do you prefer, would you be okay with a romantic partner who is smarter than you? And so the individuals, they broke down on gender lines. Most of the young women said, I don't care if he's smarter than me, that's fine. Some of them preferred for their partner to be smarter than them. Some of them were like, it doesn't matter to me. Some of them were more like, I don't mind if I'm smarter, it's fine. But the young men overwhelmingly said, I would not like a partner who is smarter than I am. And I'm not saying this example proves that there's something wrong with young men. By no means. I'm saying that I think this is a very human thing, that our ideals and our principles might have more justice than our lived experience. You know, we are still human after all. Like, it is difficult to get beyond the human frame. You know, it's not young men's fault that they might have been socialized to want to be the smarter partner in their relationship. You know, there's ways in which a lot of cultures kind of invites us to sort of think of men as smarter than women or whatever. You know, anyway, so I hope you kind of take that example with the spirit that it's given, just that this is quite common, that humans typically, we struggle with the limitations of our human frame and our emotions. And it's hard to have the kind of breadth of view that Rama is being asked to have by Brahma here. But I think that might be part of the point. Okay, so I'm going to end our discussion there. I prefer to end here, I suppose. And for next class, please watch this. It's really wonderful animated film that's inspired by the Ramayana. It came out in 2004. It's called Sita Sings the Blues. It's available for free to be streamed or downloaded online. Please do your best to watch the film before our synchronous class on Thursday, because I think it will be useful to our discussion to have the other version of the story kind of present in our discussions. So by the other version, I mean the moment when Rama continues to test Sita. You know, he exiles her to the forest to give birth on her own. I'll also post a video lecture on the film before our synchronous class, but if you don't have time to do that before Thursday's class, that's okay. Just try to watch the film. I think you'll really like it. Okay, so I'll end it there. Here's a clue about the discussion post. You know, you might pause this now and then just write your thoughts down on a piece of paper. You might have specific questions like, why does Hanuman do blank, or like, why does Rama something, why does this happen? Or more general questions like, how does Hinduism's emphasis on karma alter our understanding of fate? Whatever, just write down your thoughts. You know, my main question is like, why does Sita need to be tested by fire? Post your question, comment, confusion to the discussion thread for Tuesday's synchronous class, asynchronous class. Okay, nice.